Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family. Jean, Allie, Daniel, Juliet, Kaylee, and Evelyn. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, fictional readings, and full books found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue our month of relaxing travel readings with more from a rather popular work. We're reading Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson, first published in 1879 and republished in 1907 by Chatto and Windus, London. Let's pick up right where we left off as we leave Pont de Montvert. Let's begin. In the valley of the Tarn. A new road leads from Pont de Montvert to Florac by the valley of the Tarn. A smooth, sandy ledge, it runs about halfway between the summit of the cliffs and the river in the bottom of the valley, and I went in and out as I followed it, from bays of shadow into promontories of afternoon sun. This was a pass like that of Killiecrankie, a deep turning gully in the hills, with the Tarn making a wonderful hoarse uproar far below, and craggy summits standing in the sunshine high above. A thin fringe of ash trees ran about the hilltops, like ivy on a ruin, but on the lower slopes and far up every glen, the Spanish chestnut trees stood each 4 square to heaven under its tented foliage. Some were planted, each on its own terrace no larger than a bed. Some, trusting in their roots, found strength to grow and prosper and be straight and large upon the rapid slopes of the valley. Others, where there was a margin to the river, stood marshaled in a line and mighty like cedars of Lebanon. Yet even where they grew most thickly, they were not to be thought of as a wood, but as a herd of stalwart individuals, and the dome of each tree stood for separate and large, and as it were a little hill from among the domes of its companions. They gave forth a faint, sweet perfume which pervaded the air of the afternoon. Autumn had put tints of gold and tarnish in the green, and the sun so shone through and kindled the broad foliage that each chestnut was relieved against another, not in shadow but in light, A humble sketcher here laid down his pencil in despair. I wish I could convey a notion of the growth of those noble trees, of how they strike out boughs like the oak and trail sprays of drooping foliage like the willow, of how they stand on upright fluted columns like the pillars of a church, or like the olive, from the most shattered bole, can put out smooth and youthful shoots, and begin a new life upon the ruins of the old. Thus they partake of the nature of many different trees, and even their prickly top-knots, seen near at hand against the sky, have a certain palm-like air that impresses the imagination. But their individuality, although compounded of so many elements, is but the richer and the more original. And to look down upon a level filled with these knolls of foliage, or to see a clan of old unconquerable chestnuts cluster like herded elephants upon the spur of a mountain, is to rise to higher thoughts of the powers that are in nature. Between Modestine's laggard humor and the beauty of the scene, we made little progress all that afternoon. And at last, finding the sun, although still far from setting, was already beginning to desert the narrow valley of the Tarn, I began to cast about for a place to camp in. This was not easy to find. The terraces were too narrow, and the ground, where it was unterraced, was usually too steep for a man to lie upon. I should have slept all night and awakened towards morning with my feet or my head in the river. After perhaps a mile I saw, some 60 feet above the road, a little plateau large enough to hold my sack, and securely parapeted by the trunk of an aged and enormous chestnut. Thither, with infinite trouble, I goaded the reluctant Modestine, and there I hastened to unload her. There was only room for myself upon the plateau, and I had to go nearly as high again before I found so much as standing room for her. It was on a heap of rolling stones, on an artificial terrace, certainly not 5 feet square in all. Here I tied her to a chestnut, and having given her corn and bread, and made a pile of chestnut leaves, of which I found her greedy, I descended once more to my own encampment. The position was unpleasantly exposed. 1 or 2 carts went by upon the road, and as long as daylight lasted I concealed myself, for all the world like a hunted camisard, behind my fortification of vast chestnut trunk, for I was passionately afraid of discovery and the visit of jocular persons in the night. Moreover, I saw that I must be early awake, for these chestnut gardens had been the scene of industry no further gone than on the day before. The slope was strewn with lopped branches, and here and there a great package of leaves was propped against a trunk, for even the leaves are serviceable, and the peasants used them in winter by way of fodder for their animals. I picked a meal in fear and trembling, half lying down to hide myself from the road, and I dare say I was as much concerned as if I had been a scout from Joni's band above upon the Lozère, or from Salomon's across the Tarn, in the old times of psalm-singing and blood, or indeed perhaps more, for the Camisards had a remarkable confidence in God. And a tale comes back into my memory of how the Count of Gévaudan, riding with a party of dragoons and a notary at his saddle-bow, to enforce the oath of fidelity in all the country hamlets, entered a valley in the woods, and found Cavalier and his men at dinner, gaily seated on the grass, and their hats crowned with box tree garlands, while 15 women washed their linen in the stream. Such was a field festival in 1703. At the date Antony Watteau would be painting similar subjects. This was a very different camp from that of the night before in the cool and silent pine woods. It was warm and even stifling in the valley. The shrill song of frogs, like the tremolo note of a whistle with a P in it, rang up from the riverside before the sun was down. In the growing dusk, faint rustlings began to run to and fro among the fallen leaves. From time to time, a faint chirping or cheeping noise would fall upon my ear, and from time to time I thought I could see the movement of something swift and indistinct between the chestnuts. A profusion of large ants swarmed upon the ground. Bats whisked by, and mosquitoes droned overhead. The long boughs with their bunches of leaves hung against the sky like garlands, and those immediately above and around me had somewhat the air of a trellis which should have been wrecked and half overthrown in a gale of wind. Sleep for a long time fled my eyelids, and just as I was beginning to feel quiet stealing over my limbs and settling densely on my mind, a noise at my head startled me broad awake again, and I will frankly confess it, brought my heart into my mouth. It was such a noise as a person would make, scratching loudly with a fingernail. It came from under the knapsack which served me for a pillow, and it was thrice repeated before I had time to sit up and turn about. Nothing was to be seen, nothing more was to be heard, but a few of these mysterious rustlings far and near, and the ceaseless accompaniment of the river and the frogs. I learned next day that the chestnut gardens are infested by rats. Rustling, chirping, and scraping were probably all due to these. But the puzzle for the moment was insoluble, and I had to compose myself for sleep as best I could, in wondering uncertainty about my neighbors. I was wakened in the gray of the morning, Monday the 30th of September, by the sound of footsteps not far off upon the stones, and opening my eyes I beheld a peasant going by among the chestnuts by a footpath that I had not hitherto observed. He turned his head neither to the right nor to the left, and disappeared in a few strides among the foliage. Here was an escape, but it was plainly more than time to be moving. The peasantry were abroad, scarce less terrible to me in my nondescript position than the soldiers of Captain Pole to an undaunted Camisard. I fed Modestine with what haste I could, but as I was returning to my sack, I saw a man and a boy come down the hillside in a direction crossing mine. They unintelligibly hailed me, and I replied with inarticulate but cheerful sounds, and hurried forward to get into my gaiters. The pair, who seemed to be father and son, came slowly up to the plateau and stood close beside me for some time in silence. The bed was open, and I saw with regret my revolver lying patently disclosed on the blue wool. At last, after they had looked me all over, and the silence had grown laughably embarrassing, the man demanded in what seemed unfriendly tones, "You have slept here?" Yes, said I, as you see. Why? He asked. My faith, I answered lightly. I was tired. He next inquired where I was going and what I had had for dinner. And then, without the least transition, C'est bien, he added, come along. And he and his son, without another word, turned off to the next chestnut tree but one, which they set to pruning. The thing had passed off more simply than I hoped. He was a grave, respectable man, and his unfriendly voice did not imply that he thought he was speaking to a criminal, but merely to an inferior. I was soon on the road, nibbling a cake of chocolate, and seriously occupied with a case of conscience. Was I to pay for my night's lodging? I had slept ill. The bed was full of fleas in the shape of ants. There was no water in the room. The very dawn had neglected to call me in the morning. I might have missed a train had there been any in the neighborhood to catch. Clearly, I was dissatisfied with my entertainment, and I decided I should not pay unless I met a beggar. The valley looked even lovelier by morning, and soon the road descended into the level of the river. Here, in a place where many straight and prosperous chestnuts stood together, making an aisle upon a swarded terrace, I made my morning toilette in the water of the tarn. It was marvelously clear, thrillingly cool. The soapsuds disappeared as if by magic in the swift current, and the white boulders gave one a model for cleanliness. To wash in one of God's rivers in the open air seems to me a sort of cheerful solemnity, or semi-pagan act of worship. To dabble among dishes in a bedroom may perhaps make clean the body, but the imagination takes no share in such a cleansing. I went on with a light and peaceful heart, and sang psalms to the spiritual ear as I advanced. Suddenly up came an old woman who point-blank demanded alms. Good, thought I, here comes the waiter with the bill, and I paid for my night's lodging on the spot. Take it how you please, but this was the first and the last beggar that I met with during all my tour. A step or two farther, I was overtaken by an old man in a brown nightcap, clear-eyed, weather-beaten, with a faint, excited smile. A little girl followed him, driving 2 sheep and a goat. But she kept in our wake, while the old man walked beside me and talked about the morning and the valley. It was not much past 6, and for healthy people who have slept enough, that is an hour of expansion and of open and trustful talk. Connaissez-vous le Seigneur? He said at length. I asked him what Seigneur he meant, but he only repeated the question with more emphasis, and a look in his eyes denoting hope and interest. Ah, I said, pointing upwards, I understand you now. Yes, I know him. He is of the best of acquaintances. The old man said he was delighted. Hold, he added, striking his bosom, it makes me happy here. There were a few who knew the Lord in these valleys, he went on to tell me. Not many, but a few. Many are called, he quoted, and few chosen. My father, said I, it is not easy to say who know the Lord, and it is none of our business. Protestants and Catholics, and even those who worship stones, may know him and be known by him, for he has made all. I did not know I was so good a preacher. The old man assured me he thought as I did, and repeated his expressions of pleasure at meeting me. "We're so few," he said. "They call us Moravians here, but down in the department of Gard, where there are also a good number, they are called Derbists, after an English pastor." I began to understand that I was figuring in questionable taste as a member of some sect to me unknown. But I was more pleased with the pleasure of my companion than embarrassed by my own equivocal position. Indeed, I can see no dishonesty in not avowing a difference, and especially in these high matters, where we have all a sufficient assurance that whoever may be in the wrong, we ourselves are not completely in the right. The truth is much talked about, but this old man in a brown nightcap showed himself so simple, sweet, and friendly that I am not unwilling to profess myself his convert. He was, as a matter of fact, a Plymouth Brother. Of what that involves in the way of doctrine, I have no idea, nor the time to inform myself, but I know right well that we are all embarked upon a troublesome world, the children of one Father, striving in many essential points to do and to become the same. And although it was somewhat in a mistake that he shook hands with me so often and showed himself so ready to receive my words, that was a mistake of the truth-finding sort. For charity begins blindfold, and only through a series of similar misapprehensions rises at length into a settled principle of love and patience, and a firm belief in all our fellow men. If I deceived this good old man, in the like manner I would willingly go on to deceive others. And if ever at length, out of our separate and sad ways, we should all come together into one common house, I have a hope to which I cling dearly, that my mountain Plymouth brother will hasten to shake hands with me again. Thus talking like Christian and faithful by the way, he and I came down upon a hamlet by the tarn. It was but a humble place called La Vernede, with less than a dozen houses and a Protestant chapel on a knoll. Here he dwelt, and here at the inn I ordered my breakfast. The inn was kept by an agreeable young man, a stonebreaker on the road, and his sister, a pretty and engaging girl. The village schoolmaster dropped in to speak with the stranger. And these were all Protestants, a fact which pleased me more than I should have expected. And what pleased me still more, they seemed all upright and simple people. The Plymouth Brother hung round me with a sort of yearning interest, and returned at least thrice to make sure I was enjoying my meal. His behavior touched me deeply at the time, and even now moves me in recollection. He feared to intrude, but he would not willingly forego one moment of my society, and he seemed never weary of shaking me by the hand. When all the rest had drifted off to their day's work, I sat for near half an hour with the young mistress of the house, who talked pleasantly over her seam of the chestnut harvest, and the beauties of the tarn, and old family affections, broken up when young folk go from home, but still subsisting. Hers, I am sure, was a sweet nature, with a country plainness and much delicacy underneath, and he who takes her to his heart will doubtless be a fortunate young man. The valley below La Vernede pleased me more and more as I went forward. Now the hills approached from either hand, naked and crumbling, and walled in the river between cliffs. And now the valley widened and became green. The road led me past the old castle of Maral on a steep, past a battlemented monastery, long since broken up and turned into a church and parsonage, and past a cluster of black roofs, the village of Cocores, sitting among vineyards and meadows and orchards, thick with red apples, and where along the highway they were knocking down walnuts from the roadside trees and gathering them in sacks and baskets. The hills, however much the veil might open, were still tall and bare, with cliffy battlements and here and there a pointed summit. And the tarn still rattled through the stones with a mountain noise. I had been led, by bagmen of a picturesque turn of mind, to expect a horrific country after the heart of Byron. But to my Scottish eyes it seemed smiling and plentiful, as the weather still gave an impression of high summer to my Scottish body, although the chestnuts were already picked out by the autumn, and the poplars that here began to mingle with them had turned into pale gold against the approach of winter. There was something in this landscape, smiling although wild, that explained to me the spirit of the Southern Covenanters, those who took to the hills for conscience sake in Scotland had all gloomy and bedeviled thoughts. For once that they received God's comfort, they would be twice engaged with Satan. But the Camisards had only bright and supporting visions. They dealt much more in blood, both given and taken, yet I find no obsession of the evil one in their records. With a light conscience, they pursued their life in these rough times and circumstances. The soul of Seguier, let us not forget, was like a garden. They knew they were on God's side, with a knowledge that has no parallel among the Scots. For the Scots, although they might be certain of the cause, could never rest confident of the person. We flew, says one old Camisard, when we heard the sound of psalm singing, we flew as if with wings. We felt within us an animating ardor, a transporting desire. The feeling cannot be expressed in words. It is a thing that must have been experienced to be understood. However weary we might be, we thought no more of our weariness, and grew light so soon as the psalms fell upon our ears. The valley of the Tarn and the people whom I met at La Vernede not only explained to me this passage, but the 20 years of suffering which those who were so stiff and so bloody when once they betook themselves to war endured with the meekness of children and the constancy of saints and peasants. Florac. On a branch of the Tarn stands Florac, the seat of a sub-prefecture, with an old castle, an alley of plains, many quaint street corners, and a live fountain welling from the hill. It is notable besides for handsome women, and is one of the two capitals, Alais being the other, of the country of the Camisards. The landlord of the inn took me, after I had eaten, to an adjoining cafe, where I, or rather my journey, became the topic of the afternoon. Every one had some suggestion for my guidance, and the sub-prefectorial map was fetched from the sub-prefecture itself, and much thumbed among coffee cups and glasses of liqueur. Most of these kind advisers were Protestant, though I observed that Protestant and Catholic intermingled in a very easy manner, and it surprised me to see what a lively memory still subsisted of the religious war. Among the hills of the southwest, by Moschleen, Cumnock, or Kersvern, in isolated farms or in the manse, serious Presbyterian people still recall the days of the Great Persecution, and the graves of local martyrs are still piously regarded. But in towns and among the so-called better classes, I fear that these old doings have become an idle tale. If you met a mixed company in the King's Arms at Wigton, it is not likely that the talk would run on Covenanters. Nay, at Muirkirk of Glenluce, I found the beadle's wife had not so much as heard of Prophet Peden. But these Sevenols were proud of their ancestors in quite another sense. The war was their chosen topic. Its exploits were their own patent of nobility, and where a man or a race has had but one adventure, and that heroic, we must expect and pardon some prolixity of reference. They told me the country was still full of legends hitherto uncollected. I heard from them about Cavaliers' descendants, not direct descendants be it understood, but only cousins or nephews, who were still prosperous people in the scene of the boy general's exploits. And one farmer had seen the bones of old combatants dug up into the air of an afternoon in the 19th century, in a field where the ancestors had fought, and the great-grandchildren were peaceably ditching. Later in the day, one of the Protestant pastors was so good as to visit me, a young man, intelligent and polite, with whom I passed an hour or two in talk. Florac, he told me, is part Protestant, part Catholic, and the difference in religion is usually doubled by a difference in politics. You may judge of my surprise, coming as I did from such a babbling purgatorial Poland of a place as Monastier, where I learned that the population lived together on very quiet terms, and there was even an exchange of hospitalities between households thus doubly separated. Black Camisard and white Camisard, militiaman and Miquelet and dragoon, Protestant prophet and Catholic cadet of the White Cross. They had all been sabering and shooting, burning, pillaging, and murdering, their hearts hot with indignant passion. And here, after 170 years, Protestant is still Protestant, Catholic still Catholic, in mutual toleration and mild amity of life. But the race of man, like that indomitable nature whence it sprang, has medicating virtues of its own. The years and seasons bring various harvests. The sun returns after the rain, and mankind outlives secular animosities. As a single man awakens from the passions of a day, we judge our ancestors from a more divine position, and the dust being a little laid with several centuries, we can see both sides adorned with human virtues and fighting with a show of right. I have never thought it easy to be just, and find it daily even harder than I thought. I own I met these Protestants with a delight and a sense of coming home. I was accustomed to speak their language. in another and deeper sense of the word than that which distinguishes between French and English. For the true Babel is a divergence upon morals, and hence I could hold more free communication with the Protestants and judge them more justly than the Catholics. Father Apollinaris may pair off with my mountain Plymouth brother as two guileless and devout old men. Yet I ask myself if I had as ready a feeling for the virtues of the Trappist, or had I been a Catholic, if I should have felt so warmly to the dissenter of La Vernède. With the first I was on terms of mere forbearance, but with the other, although only on a misunderstanding and by keeping on selected points, it was still possible to hold converse and exchange some honest thoughts. In this world of imperfection, we gladly welcome even partial intimacies. And if we find but one to whom we can speak out of our heart freely, with whom we can walk in love and simplicity without dissimulation, we have no ground of quarrel with the world or God. In the valley of the Miment. On Tuesday, the 1st of October, we left Florac late in the afternoon, a tired donkey and tired donkey driver. A little way up the Tarnon, a covered bridge of wood introduced us into the valley of the Miment. Steep, rocky red mountains overhung the stream. Great oaks and chestnuts grew upon the slopes or in stony terraces. Here and there was a red field of millet or a few apple trees studded with red apples. And the road passed hard by two black hamlets, one with an old castle atop to please the heart of the tourist. It was difficult here again to find a spot fit for my encampment. Even under the oaks and chestnuts, the ground had not only a very rapid slope, but was heaped with loose stones, and where there was no timber, the hills descended to the stream in a red precipice tufted with heather. The sun had left the highest peak in front of me, and the valley was full of the lowing sound of herdsmen's horns as they recalled the flocks into the stable. When I spied a bight of meadow some way below the roadway in an angle of the river, thither I descended, and tying Modestine provisionally to a tree, proceeded to investigate the neighborhood. A gray, pearly evening shadow filled the glen. Objects at a little distance grew indistinct and melted bafflingly into each other, and the darkness was rising steadily like an exhalation. I approached a great oak which grew in the meadow hard by the river's brink, when to my disgust the voices of children fell upon my ear, and I beheld a house round the angle on the other bank. I had half a mind to pack and be gone again, but the growing darkness moved me to remain. I had only to make no noise until the night was fairly come, and trust to the dawn to call me early in the morning. But it was hard to be annoyed by neighbors in such a great hotel. A hollow underneath the oak was my bed. Before I had fed Modestine and arranged my sack, 3 stars were already brightly shining, and the others were beginning dimly to appear. I slipped down to the river, which looked very black among its rocks, to fill my can, and dined with a good appetite in the dark, for I scrupled to light a lantern while so near a house. The moon, which I had seen a pallid crescent all afternoon, faintly illuminated the summit of the hills, but not a ray fell into the bottom of the glen where I was lying. The oak rose before me like a pillar of darkness, and overhead the heartsome stars were set in the face of the night. No one knows the stars who has not slept, as the French happily put it, à la belle étoile. He may know all their names and distances and magnitudes, and yet be ignorant of what alone concerns mankind, their serene and gladsome influence on the mind. The greater part of poetry is about the stars, and very justly, for they are themselves the most classical of poets. These same faraway worlds, sprinkled like tapers, or shaken together like a diamond dust upon the sky, had looked not otherwise to Roland or Cavalier, when in the words of the latter they had no other tent but the sky, and no other bed than my mother earth. All night a strong wind blew up the valley, and the acorns fell pattering over me from the oak. Yet on this first night of October, the air was as mild as May, and I slept with the fur thrown back. I was much disturbed by the barking of a dog, an animal that I fear more than any wolf. A dog is vastly braver, and is besides supported by the sense of duty. If you kill a wolf, you meet with encouragement and praise. But if you kill a dog, the sacred rights of property and the domestic affections come clamoring round you for redress. At the end of a long day, the sharp, cruel note of a dog's bark is in itself a keen annoyance, and to a tramp like myself, he represents the sedentary and respectable world in its most hostile form. There is something of the clergyman or the lawyer about this engaging animal, and if he were not amenable to stones, the boldest man would shrink from traveling afoot. I respect dogs much in the domestic circle, but on the highway or sleeping afield, I both detest and fear them. I was wakened next morning, Wednesday, October 2nd, by the same dog, for I knew his bark, making a charge down the bank, and then, seeing me sit up, retreating again with great alacrity. The stars were not yet quite extinguished. The heaven was of that enchanting, mild gray blue of the early morn. A still, clear light began to fall, and the trees on the hillside were outlined sharply against the sky. The wind had veered more to the north, and no longer reached me in the glen. But as I was going on with my preparations, it drove a white cloud very swiftly over the hilltop. And looking up, I was surprised to see the cloud dyed with gold. In these high regions of the air, the sun was already shining as at noon. If only the clouds traveled high enough, we should see the same thing all night long, for it is always daylight in the fields of space. As I began to go up the valley, a draught of wind came down it out of the seat of the sunrise, although the clouds continued to run overhead in an almost contrary direction. A few steps farther, and I saw a whole hillside gilded with the sun. And still a little beyond, between two peaks, a center of dazzling brilliancy appeared floating in the sky, and I was once more face to face with the big bonfire that occupies the kernel of our system. I met but one human being that forenoon, a dark, military-looking wayfarer who carried a game bag on a baldric, but he made a remark that seems worthy of record. For when I asked him if he were Protestant or Catholic, "Oh," said he, "I make no shame of my religion. I am a Catholic." He made no shame of it. The phrase is a piece of natural statistics, for it is the language of one in a minority. I thought with a smile of Baville and his dragoons, and how you may ride roughshod over a religion for a century and leave it only the more lively for the friction. Ireland is still Catholic, the Cevennes still Protestant. It is not a basketful of law papers, nor the hoofs and pistol butts of a regiment of horse that can change one tittle of a ploughman's thoughts. Outdoor rustic people have not many ideas, but such as they have are hardy plants and thrive flourishingly in persecution. One who has grown a long while in the sweat of laborious noons and under the stars at night, a frequenter of hills and forests, an old honest countryman, has in the end a sense of communion with the powers of the universe and amicable relations towards his God. Like my mountain Plymouth brother, he knows the Lord. His religion does not repose upon a choice of logic. It is the poetry of the man's experience, the philosophy of the history of his life. God, like a great power, like a great shining sun, has appeared to this simple fellow in the course of years and become the ground and essence of his least reflections. And you may change creeds and dogmas by authority, or proclaim a new religion with the sound of trumpets if you will. But here is a man who has his own thoughts, and will stubbornly adhere to them in good and evil. He is a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Plymouth Brother, in an indefeasible sense, for he could not vary from his faith unless he could eradicate all memory of the past, and in a strict and not a conventional meaning, change his mind. And with that assertion and the end of this section, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson, who once again delights us with his mix of physical observation and philosophy. We have one more reading from this wonderful book, which I'll be doing before the end of this year, so that's something to look forward to. If you can't wait and you'd like to know how this ends, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.